Watch the Imam in robes leading the attack. His name is Khalim. He's destroying a Christian memorial with sledgehammers and spray paint. Then sudden wind strikes. He falls to the knees. Followers scatter in fear.
I'm Khalim, and I'm 42 years old. On June 20th, 2021, I led a violent attack on a Christian memorial right here in America. I was a radical imam, consumed with hatred for everything Christian. What happened that day completely shattered everything I believed about God and changed my life forever. I came to America when I was 19 years old, filled with dreams and hope for a better life. My family had scraped together everything they had to send me here from Pakistan, believing that America would offer opportunities we could never imagine back home. But somewhere along the way, those dreams turned into something dark and twisted. The bitterness that grew in my heart became like poison, spreading through every part of my life until I could barely recognize the young man who had once been so grateful to be here. The first few years were incredibly difficult. I worked multiple jobs just to survive, sending money back to my family while trying to make sense of this new culture that seemed so foreign to everything I had known. I felt isolated and alone, watching other immigrants seem to thrive while I struggled just to keep my head above water. The language barrier made everything harder, and I often felt like people were looking down on me, treating me like I was less than human because of my accent and my faith. It was during those lonely years that I first encountered the mosque that would eventually become my spiritual home, but also the place where my heart would harden against everything American and Christian. The Imam there was a man who spoke with such passion about the injustices Muslims faced in America. He painted a picture of a country that was inherently hostile to our faith, where Christians held all the power and used it to oppress and marginalize people like us. His words resonated with the frustration and anger I was already feeling. As I spent more time at the mosque, listening to sermon after sermon about how America was waging a war against Islam, I began to see examples of this supposed persecution everywhere I looked. When I was passed over for promotions at work, I convinced myself it was because of my faith. When people seemed uncomfortable around me, I told myself it was because they hated Muslims. Every slight, real or imagined, became evidence of the systematic oppression the Imam preached about so frequently. I threw myself into studying Islamic texts, but not the peaceful, loving passages that speak of mercy and compassion. Instead, I focused on the verses that could be twisted to justify anger and even violence against those who opposed our faith. I convinced myself that this was pure Islam, that the peaceful interpretations were watered-down versions created to appease our enemies. The more I studied these selective interpretations, the more righteous my anger felt. Years passed, and my reputation within the mosque grew. I became known as someone who truly understood the struggle Muslims faced in America. Other young men began coming to me for guidance, seeking answers to their own feelings of displacement and frustration. I had found my calling, or so I believed. I started leading small study groups, teaching these young men the same twisted interpretations that had captured my own heart. The transformation from frustrated immigrant to radical preacher happened so gradually that I barely noticed it. One day I was complaining about feeling unwelcome in America, and the next I was actively teaching others to view Christians as enemies of our faith. I convinced myself that I was protecting Islam, that I was standing up for the honor of Allah in a land that had forgotten God entirely. My followers trusted me completely. There was Brother Ahmed, barely 20 years old, who hung on my every word like I was speaking divine truth. There was Brother Hassan, who had lost his job and blamed Christian employers for discriminating against him. There was Brother Omar, whose anger burned almost as hot as my own, always ready to take action against those who insulted our faith. These young men looked to me as their spiritual guide, and I fed them a steady diet of hatred disguised as religious devotion. I taught them that Christians had declared war on Islam long before we ever fought back. I showed them news articles about conflicts in Muslim countries and told them that American Christians supported every bomb that fell on our brothers and sisters overseas. I twisted every piece of evidence to fit the narrative that we were under attack, that we had every right to defend ourselves by any means necessary. The Christian memorial downtown became a symbol of everything I hated about America. Every time I drove past that cross, I felt my blood pressure rise. It represented Christian dominance, Christian arrogance, the assumption that their faith was welcome everywhere while ours was barely tolerated. In my mind, that memorial was a declaration that America belonged to Christians and Christians alone. I began to speak more and more about taking action, not just talking about our grievances, but actually doing something about them. I told my followers that prayer alone was not enough, that Allah expected us to stand up and fight for our faith. I convinced them that destroying symbols of Christian oppression would be a holy act, something that would honor both our faith and our commitment to justice. Now, I want you to ask yourself something. Have you ever felt so angry, so convinced that you were right, that you could justify almost anything? Have you ever been so certain of your own righteousness that you stopped questioning whether your actions matched your beliefs? Because that was exactly where I found myself. I was so consumed with hatred that I had forgotten every lesson about mercy, compassion, and love that true Islam actually teaches. The planning became an obsession. We would strike at that memorial, destroy it completely, and send a message that Muslims would not be silent anymore. I convinced my followers that this was our duty, that Allah Himself was calling us to this action. Looking back now, I realize how completely I had deceived both myself and these young men who trusted me. But at the time, I felt nothing but righteous purpose as we prepared for what I believed would be our moment of divine service. The planning consumed my every waking moment for 3 weeks leading up to June 20th. I had convinced myself that this wasn't just an act of vandalism, but a holy mission that would strike fear into the hearts of those who oppressed Muslims in America. Every detail had to be perfect, every contingency planned for, because I believed Allah was watching and expecting nothing less than complete dedication to this cause. I held secret meetings in the basement of my apartment building, gathering my 5 most devoted followers around a table where we spread out photos of the memorial taken from every angle. I had driven past that site dozens of times, studying the layout, noting when security was lightest, observing the patterns of foot traffic throughout different times of day. The memorial sat in a small plaza surrounded by office buildings, with the cross monument rising about 12 feet high and a bronze plaque at its base commemorating Christian soldiers who had died in various wars. Brother Ahmed was the youngest of our group, barely 22, with an eagerness that reminded me of myself at that age. He volunteered for every dangerous task, always asking what more he could do to serve our cause. Brother Hassan brought a methodical precision to our planning, sketching out escape routes and timing everything down to the minute. Brother Omar's anger burned almost as hot as my own, and I knew I could count on him to follow through when the moment came. The other 2 brothers were quieter, but their commitment never wavered during our planning sessions. We decided to strike early in the morning when the plaza would be mostly empty, but still light enough for our message to be clearly visible to anyone who discovered the aftermath. I wanted the destruction to be thorough and unmistakable, leaving no doubt about who was responsible or why we had acted. We would arrive in 2 separate vehicles, park several blocks away, and approach on foot, carrying our equipment in ordinary gym bags to avoid suspicion. The weapons we chose were simple but effective: heavy sledgehammers for the main destruction, spray paint for our message, and smaller tools for detail work on the bronze plaque. I insisted that each of us practice our assigned tasks repeatedly, timing ourselves and working on our technique. Brother Ahmed became expert with the hammer, able to deliver devastating blows with perfect accuracy. Brother Hassan perfected the spray painting, practicing our planned message in Arabic script that would make our identity unmistakable. I spent hours writing the message we would leave behind, crafting words that would strike terror into the hearts of Christians while inspiring other Muslims to follow our example. The Arabic script would proclaim that Allah's judgment had come to America, that Christian symbols would no longer be tolerated on soil that belonged to the faithful. I convinced myself that these words carried divine authority, that I was merely serving as Allah's messenger in delivering this warning to an unbelieving nation. The night before our mission, I could barely sleep. My heart pounded with what I believed was righteous excitement, the anticipation of finally taking action after years of watching our faith be insulted and degraded in America. I performed extra prayers, asking Allah to bless our mission and grant us success in striking this blow against Christian oppression. Looking back now, I realize how completely I had twisted prayer into something unrecognizable, using it to justify violence instead of seeking peace. I called each of my followers that night, speaking to them in code we had developed during our planning. Everyone confirmed they were ready, their voices filled with the same excitement I felt. We had become like a military unit preparing for battle, convinced that we were soldiers in a holy war that would determine the future of Islam in America. The responsibility of leadership felt heavy on my shoulders, but I welcomed that weight as proof of Allah's trust in me. June 20th dawned overcast and cool, which I took as a sign that even the weather was cooperating with our mission. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing clothes that would allow me to move freely while still showing respect for the religious nature of our task. I wrapped my prayer beads around my wrist and tucked a small Quran into my jacket pocket, believing these would provide spiritual protection during our action. We met at the designated spot, 6 blocks from the memorial, at exactly 9:30 a.m. Each brother arrived precisely on time, carrying their assigned equipment in innocent-looking gym bags. I looked into their faces and saw the same determination I felt burning in my own heart. We were no longer just angry young men complaining about our treatment in America. We had become instruments of divine justice, ready to deliver Allah's judgment on those who had shown such disrespect for our faith. The walk to the memorial felt both endless and far too short. My heart hammered against my ribs with every step, but I interpreted this as excitement rather than the warning it should have been. I reviewed our plan one final time as we walked, making sure everyone knew their role and timing. Brother Ahmed would strike the first blow against the cross itself, while Brother Hassan began spray painting our message. The others would work on destroying the plaque and any other Christian symbols they could find. As we approached the plaza, I felt a surge of power that I mistook for divine approval. This was our moment, our chance to show America that Muslims would no longer accept being treated as second-class citizens in our own country. I raised my hand to signal the beginning of our attack, and my followers responded instantly, pulling their tools from the bags with practiced efficiency. The first blow of my hammer against that memorial felt like striking a blow for justice itself. The sound of metal against stone rang out across the plaza, and I knew there was no turning back. We had crossed a line that would define the rest of our lives, though none of us could have imagined just how dramatically our world was about to change. The moment my sledgehammer connected with the bronze memorial plaque, I felt what I believed was the righteous satisfaction of striking a blow for Allah. The metallic clang echoed across the plaza, and I swung again with even more force, watching pieces of the dedication scatter across the concrete. My followers had spread out according to our plan, each one attacking their assigned target with the precision we had practiced for weeks. Brother Ahmed was working on the base of the cross monument, his hammer strikes creating deep gouges in the stone foundation. I could see the concentration on his face as he focused on each blow, determined to prove his dedication to our cause. Brother Hassan had begun spray painting our message in bold Arabic script across the remaining portion of the memorial, the red paint stark against the gray stone like blood against bone. The sound of our destruction filled the morning air. Hammer blows, the hiss of spray paint, the crash of breaking stone, all creating a symphony of what I thought was justice being served. I felt intoxicated by the power of it, by the knowledge that we were finally taking action instead of just talking about our grievances. Every swing of my hammer felt like I was striking back against years of humiliation and discrimination. Brother Omar had moved to a smaller commemorative plaque near the base, methodically chipping away at the Christian symbols etched into its surface. The other 2 brothers worked on toppling a small statue of praying hands that sat beside the main monument. We moved with the efficiency of a well-trained team, each focused on our individual tasks while remaining aware of the others around us. I paused for a moment to survey our progress, feeling a surge of pride at how effectively we were dismantling this symbol of Christian dominance. The memorial that had stood as a testament to Christian privilege was being reduced to rubble by Muslim hands, and I believed this was exactly what Allah wanted from us. The message we were sending would reverberate through every Christian community in America. That was when I noticed the sky beginning to change. The overcast morning had been perfect for our mission, providing enough light to work while keeping most people indoors. But now the clouds seemed to be darkening in a way that didn't feel natural. I glanced up briefly, then returned to my work, assuming it was just a weather front moving through the area. Brother Hassan called out that he had finished the main portion of our message, his voice filled with the same excitement I felt. The Arabic script proclaimed our victory over Christian oppression, declaring that Allah's judgment had come to those who had shown such disrespect for the true faith. I felt a moment of perfect satisfaction as I read his work, knowing that everyone who saw this destruction would understand exactly who was responsible and why we had acted. The wind started as barely a whisper, just enough to scatter some of the debris from our demolition work. I barely noticed it at first, focused as I was on delivering what I intended to be the final, decisive blow to the main memorial plaque. But the wind grew stronger with each passing second, and soon it was whipping around the plaza in a way that made no meteorological sense. I had lived in this area for over 20 years, and I had never experienced wind like this. It wasn't the steady pressure of a storm front or the gusting of normal weather patterns. This wind seemed to spiral around the memorial site specifically, growing stronger and more focused with each moment. The loose papers and debris from our destruction began swirling in tight circles, creating small tornadoes of destruction that moved independent of any natural air currents. Brother Ahmed stopped his work and looked around in confusion, his hammer frozen mid-swing as he tried to understand what was happening. The wind was now strong enough to make standing upright a challenge, and I found myself leaning into it just to maintain my balance. This wasn't part of our plan, and I felt the first stirring of unease as I realized we were dealing with something completely beyond our control or understanding. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, though I couldn't be sure if this was real or just my imagination responding to the increasing strangeness of the situation. The wind continued to intensify, now howling around the memorial site with a sound that reminded me of voices crying out in languages I couldn't understand. Brother Hassan had stopped his spray painting and was backing away from the monument, his eyes wide with an expression I had never seen before. I tried to call out to my followers to maintain control of the situation and get everyone refocused on completing our mission. But my voice was lost in the roar of the wind, and I could see that each of them was struggling just to stay on their feet. The debris from our destruction work was now flying through the air like projectiles, forcing us to duck and cover our heads for protection. The wind reached a crescendo that felt almost supernatural in its intensity. I had never experienced anything like this in my entire life, and every instinct in my body was telling me that something was terribly wrong. This wasn't just unusual weather. This was something that defied every natural explanation I could think of, and for the first time since we had begun our attack, I felt genuine fear. Brother Omar was the first to lose his footing completely, the wind knocking him backwards so hard that he tumbled across the concrete plaza. I watched in shock as this young man who had seemed so strong and determined just moments before was tossed around like a child's toy by forces none of us could comprehend or control. That was when I realized that everything I thought I knew about this mission, about our cause, about Allah's approval of our actions, might be completely wrong. The wind wasn't just strong. It was targeted, focused, almost angry in its intensity, as if the very air around us was responding to what we had done with something that felt remarkably like divine displeasure. The moment that wind knocked Brother Omar to the ground, something inside my chest cracked open like an egg. I had never felt anything like the sensation that washed over me in that instant. It wasn't fear, though fear was certainly part of it. It wasn't confusion, though I was more confused than I had ever been in my life. It was something deeper, something that reached into the very core of who I thought I was and shattered it completely. My sledgehammer felt impossibly heavy in my hands, as if it had suddenly gained 100 pounds. I tried to raise it again, to complete the destruction we had come here to accomplish. But my arms wouldn't obey. The weight of that tool, which had felt so righteous just moments before, now felt like the weight of every wrong decision I had ever made. My fingers loosened without my permission, and I watched the hammer fall from my grip and clatter uselessly onto the concrete. The tears started before I even realized I was crying. They came from somewhere so deep inside me that I hadn't even known that place existed. Hot, burning tears that felt like they were washing away years of accumulated anger and hatred with each drop that fell. I had not cried since I was a small child, had trained myself to see tears as weakness, as something beneath the dignity of a man who served Allah. But these tears were beyond my control, beyond any training or discipline I had ever developed. My knees hit the concrete with a sound I felt more than heard. The impact should have hurt, should have jarred me back to my senses, but instead it felt like coming home to something I had been searching for my entire life without knowing it. I knelt there in the wreckage of our attack, surrounded by the debris of the memorial we had tried to destroy, and felt my entire worldview crumbling around me like the stone we had just shattered. The words came out of my mouth before my brain had any chance to stop them. They were words I had never thought I would say, words that went against everything I had believed and taught for the past 15 years of my life. But they came from a place so authentic, so true, that I couldn't have held them back if my life had depended on it. Jesus, I whispered, and then louder, Jesus, what have I done? The sound of my own voice speaking that name shocked me more than the supernatural wind had. I had trained myself to speak that name only with contempt, only in the context of explaining to my followers why Christians were our enemies. But now it came out like a prayer, like a plea, like the name of someone I desperately needed to reach but wasn't sure would listen to someone like me. I could hear my followers around me, some calling my name, others running away in terror, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. Everything felt distant except for the overwhelming presence of something I couldn't name, but could feel pressing down on me with the weight of absolute truth. It was as if someone was standing right beside me, someone I couldn't see but whose presence was more real than anything I had ever experienced. The tears were flowing freely now, and with them came memories I had buried so deep I had forgotten they existed. I remembered being a young man, newly arrived in America, full of hope and gratitude. I remembered the kindness of strangers who had helped me when I was lost and confused. I remembered Christian co-workers who had invited me to their homes, who had treated me like family even though I was different from them. I remembered the moment I had made the conscious choice to focus on grievance instead of gratitude, to nurture anger instead of appreciation. I could see with horrible clarity how I had twisted every act of kindness into evidence of condescension, how I had interpreted every moment of awkwardness as proof of hatred. I had taken the disappointments and difficulties that every immigrant faces and used them as justification for the poison I had allowed to grow in my heart. But more than that, I could see what I had done to these young men who had trusted me. Brother Ahmed, barely out of his teens, following my lead because he believed I spoke with divine authority. Brother Hassan, struggling with his own sense of displacement, looking to me for guidance and receiving hatred instead of wisdom. Brother Omar, whose natural anger I had fed and nurtured until it had grown into something monstrous. What have I done? I said again, louder this time. And the question seemed to echo not just in the plaza, but in my very soul. What have I done to them? What have I done to myself? What have I done to you? The last question surprised me most of all, because I realized I wasn't talking to Allah anymore. I was talking to the Jesus whose name I had just spoken, the Jesus whose followers I had been trying to terrorize just moments before. And somehow, impossibly, I could feel him listening. Not with the anger I deserved, not with the condemnation I expected, but with something that felt remarkably like sorrow for what I had become. I don't know how long I knelt there, but eventually I became aware that someone was approaching. I looked up through my tears to see a man in his 60s, wearing simple clothes and a clerical collar, walking carefully across the debris-strewn plaza. His face showed no fear, no anger, just a deep sadness as he surveyed the destruction we had caused. This had to be the local pastor from the church across the street, the man whose memorial we had just attacked. He should have been calling the police, should have been demanding our arrest, should have been angry beyond words at what we had done to this place that clearly meant so much to his community. Instead, he walked over to where I was kneeling and, without saying a word, knelt down beside me. "Son," he said, and his voice was gentle in a way that broke my heart all over again. "What's happened to you? What's brought you to this place?" I tried to speak, tried to explain or justify or defend what we had done, but the only words that would come were the same ones I had been repeating. "What have I done? Oh God, what have I done?" He reached out and placed his hand on my shoulder, and that simple touch of human compassion after years of nurturing hatred was almost more than I could bear. The pastor helped me to my feet with a gentleness that I absolutely did not deserve. His name was Pastor Mitchell, and instead of calling the police as any reasonable person would have done, he invited me to his church to talk. I couldn't understand why this man whose memorial I had just destroyed was showing me kindness instead of the hatred I expected, and frankly deserved. My followers had scattered during my breakdown, some running away in terror, others standing at a distance watching in confusion as their leader knelt crying beside the enemy they thought we were supposed to hate. That first conversation in Pastor Mitchell's office lasted 4 hours. I sat across from this man whose community I had just attacked, expecting him to try to convert me, or condemn me, or demand some kind of justice for what I had done. Instead, he asked me about my story, about what had brought me to America, about the pain I was carrying that had turned into such destructive anger. He listened without judgment as I poured out years of bitterness and frustration, nodding with understanding when I described feeling like an outsider in the country I had hoped would become home. For the first time in years, someone was treating me like a human being instead of a symbol of something to be feared or an authority figure to be obeyed. Pastor Mitchell didn't try to defend Christianity or attack Islam. He simply listened to my pain and acknowledged that the struggles I had faced as an immigrant were real and difficult. But he also gently challenged me to consider whether the hatred I had embraced was really solving any of those problems or just creating new ones. I left that first meeting more confused than I'd ever been in my life. Everything I thought I knew about Christians, about America, about my own faith, had been shaken to its foundation. I drove home in a daze, still trying to process what had happened at the memorial and why this pastor had treated me with such unexpected compassion. My wife was waiting for me, having heard about the incident through the network of families connected to our mosque. Fatima was furious when I told her about my conversation with the pastor. She accused me of betraying everything we believed in, of allowing the enemy to confuse me with false kindness. She reminded me of all the sermons I had preached about the war between Islam and Christianity, demanding to know how I could even consider listening to anything a Christian pastor had to say. Her anger was understandable, but it felt foreign to me now, like an echo of the person I used to be, but could no longer fully recognize. The next few weeks were the most difficult of my life. I found myself unable to pray the way I had before, unable to preach with the same fire and conviction that had once defined my ministry. My followers noticed the change immediately. Our brother Ahmed came to me repeatedly, asking what had happened to me, why I seemed so different since our mission at the memorial. I didn't know how to explain something I barely understood myself. During this time of spiritual crisis, I found myself doing something I had never imagined possible. I began reading the Bible in secret. Pastor Mitchell had given me a copy during our first meeting, and night after night, I found myself drawn to its pages like a man dying of thirst drawn to water. I started with the Gospels, reading about this Jesus, whose name had come so unexpectedly from my lips during my breakdown. The Jesus I discovered in those pages was nothing like the Jesus I had been taught to hate. The Christian Savior I had preached against was supposedly a symbol of Western oppression and cultural imperialism. But the Jesus I read about in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John was a Middle Eastern man who understood persecution, who stood with the poor and the marginalized, who preached love for enemies and forgiveness for those who had done wrong. I was particularly struck by the story of Jesus' crucifixion, where he prayed for forgiveness for the very people who were killing him. As someone who had spent years nursing grievances and teaching others to do the same, I couldn't comprehend that kind of radical forgiveness. It challenged everything I thought I knew about strength, about justice, about how to respond to those who hurt you. Now I want to ask you something that I had to ask myself during those difficult weeks. Have you ever held on to anger so tightly that it became part of your identity? Have you ever built your sense of purpose around fighting against something instead of fighting for something positive? Because that was exactly where I found myself, realizing that hatred had become so central to who I was that I didn't know who I would be without it. The more I read, the more I began to understand that the supernatural experience at the memorial hadn't been Allah punishing me for insufficient dedication to our cause. It had been Jesus calling me away from a path that was destroying not just my enemies, but my own soul. The wind that had knocked us down, the presence I had felt so powerfully, the words that had come from my mouth without my permission, all of it had been an invitation to step away from hatred and into something I was only beginning to understand. My former followers began to turn against me as they realized I was questioning everything I had taught them. Some confronted me directly, accusing me of becoming weak and losing my faith. Others simply stopped coming to my study sessions, spreading word through the mosque community that their former leader had been compromised by Christian influence. The respect and authority I had built over years began to crumble as quickly as the memorial we had tried to destroy. But Pastor Mitchell continued to meet with me week after week, patiently answering my questions and helping me work through the theological and personal crisis I was experiencing. He never pressured me to make any decisions or declarations. He simply offered friendship and guidance to a man who was desperately lost and trying to find his way to something that felt like truth. The moment I accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior changed everything about my life, but it didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual awakening that took place over 6 months of Bible study, prayer, and countless conversations with Pastor Mitchell. The day I finally knelt in his office and asked Jesus to forgive me for everything I had done, to wash away the hatred from my heart and make me into someone new, I felt the same supernatural presence I had experienced at the memorial. But this time, instead of knocking me down, it lifted me up. Today, 3 years later, I serve as an associate pastor at the very church whose memorial I once tried to destroy. Pastor Mitchell and I work side by side, ministering to a congregation that includes both longtime Christians and new converts like myself. The transition wasn't easy for anyone. Many church members struggled to accept that their former enemy was now their brother in Christ. Some left the church entirely, unable to reconcile their feelings about what I had done with the forgiveness that Christianity demands we offer to everyone, but those who stayed have witnessed something beautiful. They've seen what genuine repentance and transformation look like when the Holy Spirit truly changes a heart. They've watched me work tirelessly to make amends for the damage I caused, not just to their memorial, but to their sense of safety and peace in their own community. More importantly, they've seen the fruit of forgiveness, how choosing to love your enemy can turn that enemy into family. My ministry now focuses on building bridges between faith communities, particularly reaching out to young Muslim men who are struggling with the same anger and displacement I once felt. I speak at mosques, universities, and community centers, sharing my story and helping people understand that hatred is never the answer to injustice. True Islam, just like true Christianity, teaches love, compassion, and service to others. The perverted version I had embraced was a betrayal of everything both faiths actually stand for. Some of my former followers have joined me on this journey. Brother Ahmed was the first to reach out after hearing about my conversion. He had been struggling with doubt about our former mission even before the supernatural incident at the memorial. The guilt he felt about what we had done was eating him alive, and when he learned that I had found peace through Jesus, he wanted to understand how that was possible. His conversion was even more dramatic than mine, and today he serves as our youth pastor, working with teenagers from all backgrounds who are searching for purpose and belonging. Brother Hassan took longer to come around, but eventually the love and forgiveness he saw in our transformed lives broke through his resistance. He now leads our interfaith dialogue programs, using his natural gift for communication to help people from different religious backgrounds find common ground. His journey to faith was quieter than mine or Ahmed's, but no less profound. Watching this young man who once spray-painted messages of hatred, now organizing community service projects that bring Muslims and Christians together to help the poor, has been one of the greatest joys of my new life. Not all of my former followers made this transition. Brother Omar became even more radicalized after my conversion, viewing it as the ultimate betrayal. He gathered the remaining members of our former group and continued preaching hatred, now directing much of his anger toward me personally. This breaks my heart because I know the pain and emptiness that drives such hatred. I continue to pray for Omar and the others who haven't yet found the peace that comes from laying down the burden of anger and embracing love instead. My relationship with my wife, Fatima, was the most difficult part of this entire journey. For months after my conversion, she threatened to leave me, to take our children and return to Pakistan rather than remain married to someone she viewed as a traitor to Islam. The pain in her eyes during those dark months haunts me still. She had married a proud Muslim man who preached strength and defiance, and suddenly she was living with someone who talked constantly about forgiveness, love, and turning the other cheek. But Fatima is a wise woman, and over time she began to notice the changes in me that went beyond just religious beliefs. I was kinder to her, more patient with our children, more peaceful in my spirit than I had been in years. The anger that had made me difficult to live with was gone, replaced by a joy that she couldn't deny was genuine. She started attending church with me, initially just to understand what was happening to her husband, but gradually opening her heart to the message she heard there. Her conversion was quiet and personal, happening during a women's Bible study that the church had organized specifically to help her feel welcomed and understood. The women in that group loved her through her questions, her fears, and her resistance with a patience that reflected Christ's love for all of us. When Fatima finally accepted Jesus, she did so with the same wholehearted commitment she had brought to everything else in her life. Our children adapted to our new faith with the flexibility that children often show. They attend the church youth group where Brother Ahmed ministers, and they've made friends with kids from many different backgrounds. They're learning to see diversity as a blessing rather than a threat, to build relationships across cultural and religious lines that will serve them well throughout their lives. The memorial we once destroyed has been rebuilt, more beautiful than it was before, but now it includes a small plaque that tells the story of forgiveness and reconciliation, honoring not just the Christian soldiers it was originally meant to commemorate, but also celebrating the power of love to overcome hatred. I was invited to speak at the rededication ceremony, an honor that still brings tears to my eyes when I think about the grace that made such redemption possible. Look inside your own heart right now. Is there hatred there that's poisoning your relationship with God and with other people? Are you holding on to anger that's preventing you from experiencing the peace and joy that Jesus offers to everyone who comes to him? Because I want you to know that no matter what you've done, no matter how far you think you've fallen, Jesus is calling you just like he called me on that plaza 3 years ago. If Jesus can forgive someone like me, someone who spent years preaching hatred and even attacked a memorial dedicated to Christian soldiers, then he can forgive anyone. There is no sin too great, no heart too hardened, no past too dark for his love to overcome. Don't wait for a supernatural experience like mine. His arms are open right now, ready to welcome you into the family of God where former enemies become beloved brothers and sisters.